that in this country we have more firearms in civilian hands than we have civilian hands. Imagine a system where the person who's been charged is no longer allowed to defend himself. But if you're talking about rights, you at some point want to identify the most basic human right of all. What is that? Well, of course, it's the right of self-defense. That's the essential right upon which all other rights depend. If you can't defend yourself, you can't defend your family and your property, you don't have any rights at all. You're a slave by definition. So you may be wondering, in this moment of creeping authoritarianism, how is the right to self-defense doing in our country? Self-defense, the cornerstone of all freedoms, without which you cannot be free, you are owned. Self-defense is becoming illegal, in effect, in a lot of places. And not just in very liberal places, like New York City, even in states with some of the strongest self-defense laws on the books. Arizona, for example, allows residents to shoot trespassers on their property. The fact that so many Americans have a firearm within reach but never commit violence tells you that guns are not the problem. Most people in this country can be trusted with an AR-15, just as we can be trusted with cars and light aircraft and electricity and baseball bats and insecticide and chainsaws and pruning shears and countless other objects that could easily double as weapons. So now this very same system, the system that imprisoned Jose Alba and chained Moussa Diarra to his hospital bed, this Soros-inspired and backed system, is putting Joe Biden's main political opponent in the upcoming presidential race on trial for a crime that's not actually a crime. This is the political tyranny part of anarcho-tyranny. At about 5 a.m. on Saturday morning in Manhattan, a parking garage attendant called Moussa Diarra noticed a man peering into parked cars looking for things to steal. Now that's a familiar scene in New York City. Alvin Bragg, who is the local Soros-funded DA, has decided that prosecuting car burglaries is a form of white supremacy. As a result, not surprisingly, car burglaries have risen quite a bit. Moussa Diarra, the attendant, is not white, but apparently he's sick of watching other people get robbed, so he told the man to get out, leave the garage. In response, the man pulled out a handgun and fired 4 times. He hit Diarra in the head and the stomach. It was a nightmare. But somehow, Moussa Diarra had the presence of mind to wrestle the gun from the man and then fire back before the man could shoot him or anyone else. By the time police arrived, both men were lying on the sidewalk bleeding. Now, what do you think happened next? In a sane, self-respecting society, Moussa Diarra would have received a medal, if not a ticker tape parade. But in the city of New York, he was arrested and charged with attempted murder and illegal possession of a gun, the same gun that had been used to shoot him. Diarra woke up in Bellevue Hospital shackled to his bed. The New York Post ran this picture. It's of him sobbing. "I got bullets in me and I'm chained to a hospital bed," he said, "but I didn't do anything wrong." You can imagine his confusion. This was not the country he expected. And in fact, Moussa Diarra is exactly the kind of person you want more of in your country. He's 57 years old and he's still working harder than most young people do. The man who shot him, by contrast, does not have a history of going to work every day. His name is Charles Rody. We checked. He's got a rap sheet of nearly a dozen serious crimes that go back more than 20 years. And yet, as of Saturday at 5 a.m., he was not in jail. He was walking around New York with a gun looking for more things to steal. So for our existing legal system, this appears to be a point of no return. And you would think the media would point that out. Even if they support it, this is a big change from the way the country has run for hundreds of years. But no, because they're too dumb, too shallow, and above all, too self-interested. So Trump's upcoming arraignment tomorrow isn't a turning point in our country's legal system. It's yet another chance to follow Trump around in the hope that ratings will return. Well, it is a big deal, actually. It's a very, very big deal. But the guardrails are gone. No one in the media seems to be pointing out that this is a huge change in our entire legal system. And no one in the Democratic Party in Washington, even those who are a little bit concerned about where this might be heading, dares say anything at all because Alvin Bragg is, of course, a holy person and no one wants to speak out against the crowd on Twitter. So this is all happening in slow motion, and of course we're getting the dumbest possible lectures, as always, from cable news. We've learned not to put everything at 11. We're not making everything the biggest deal. It's hilarious. And of course they can't wait to make it the biggest deal. on the shallowest possible level, and the reason is economic. Since Trump left office, CNN has lost more than 60% of its viewers. They're desperately trying to sell the channel because, it's tanking. So they have every incentive to sensationalize anything that Trump does, no matter what happens to the country in the process. So here you have a Soros-funded DA perp-walking a former president. What does this mean? What could Trump possibly be guilty of? They don't even tell you. All they tell their eager but small audience is the walls are closing in on career criminal Donald Trump. They're going to turn Trump's motorcade into OJ's Bronco because otherwise they're going to be out of a job because nobody watches them anymore. Imagine a system where the person who's been charged is no longer allowed to defend himself. Oh, are you seeing the connection here? Like the parking garage attendant who was shot by a criminal, he gets arrested. Like Jose Alba, who tried to save his own life from a lunatic in his bodega, he gets arrested. The people who are the victims of the tyranny don't get to speak. CNN speaks for them. Imagine that. There are multiple reports tonight that Alvin Bragg's office will seek a gag order when Trump is arraigned. Now, that would prevent Trump, on pain of going to prison, from talking about his case in public. But CNN and MSNBC and the New York Times and the Washington Post, all the completely filthy, corrupt liars in the media, handmaidens to power, they'll be able to say whatever they want. And it's possible you've heard an advocate for gun control say that in this country we have more firearms in civilian hands than we have civilian hands. And that is true, actually. The total American population is about 332 million people, and collectively they own more than 400 million firearms. About half of all U.S. households have at least one gun at home, and many have much more than that. Plus they have ammo, billions and billions of rounds of it. Those are all real numbers, but they are hardly an argument for gun control. They're an argument, in fact, against it. Ask yourself, what would it require to confiscate all those guns and all that ammunition and turn the United States into a disarmed nation like Turkmenistan or North Korea? Well, it would take a police state, and it would end in civil war. No sane person wants either one of those things, but thankfully, we don't need them. In the late 19th century, researchers finally decided that infection is spread by germs, and as a result of that conclusion, surgeons are now required to wash their hands before they cut you open. Everybody agrees that this is progress. But what if we had refused to learn how infection is spread? What if we just didn't want to know? Well, appendectomies would still be fatal, and we would be a backward, ridiculous, uncaring people. It's impossible even to imagine that. And yet, on the question of violent crime, of murder, it's very easy to imagine that because it's happening. Our leaders are determined not to know why people shoot each other, and they don't want us to know either. They're adamant that we do not ask questions about motive. It seems, for example, like an awful lot of mass shooters have taken prescription psychiatric drugs in the days before they opened fire and killed others. Have you noticed that? Maybe you have noticed that. Good luck saying it in public. You'll be shouted down immediately by someone with an advanced degree. How dare you criticize Big Pharma? What are you, a conspiracy nut? No, actually you're not. You're someone who cares about cause and effect. You're a rational person. The only conspiracy here is the one designed to prevent you from figuring out why mass shootings keep happening. Consider the killings that took place on Monday in Nashville. The killer was a 28-year-old female transgenderist who shot her way into a Christian elementary school and murdered 3 9-year-olds and 3 adults. Why did she do that? In a rational country, that is the very first question we would ask. In our country, it's the last question. In fact, often it's never asked at all. On those rare occasions when somebody finally manages to wonder out loud about motive, our leaders immediately start lying, which should tell you a lot. How about some examples? Consider 2 shootings that took place at gas stations in the past year in the United States. The first shooting occurred around 2 p.m. on October 6th in the state of Missouri. A 23-year-old felon called Javon Taylor, who had a long criminal record, convictions for armed robbery, for example, began threatening a female clerk, apparently because the gas station didn't carry the kind of cigars that he wanted. That's when an off-duty fireman called Anthony Santee, who was inside, decided to step in. He told Javon Taylor to leave the store. Well, in response to that, Taylor began threatening him and then ran toward his SUV outside. Santee followed him outside because he suspected that Javon Taylor would retrieve a gun from the car, and that's exactly what he did. Javon Taylor pulled an illegal handgun with an extended magazine from his SUV. Santee, not wanting to get shot, put Taylor in a headlock, and that's when Javon Taylor handed the gun to his girlfriend, and his girlfriend shot the unarmed fireman in the back, killing him. It was an execution. It's not a close call. The footage is online. We're not going to show it to you because it's awful, but if you have any doubt, you can watch it. So there's no debate about what happened here. And yet the local social justice DA, Jean Peters Baker, refused to press charges against the person who killed the firefighter. Now, why? Well, there may have been a political component. And we know that because online, BLM activists immediately celebrated the killing on racial grounds. Javon Taylor was black, Anthony Santee was white. That was enough for them. They're glad he's dead. So a guy with a criminal record and a knife in his hand starts trashing your store and then runs outside to his car. You see, Naz told police later that he shot Marquis Demps because he feared for his life. He thought the guy was going to get a gun and come back and kill him. And that's a reasonable fear, of course. The Anthony Santee's murder demonstrates that it is. But in this case, the DA, a Soros-funded anti-police political activist called Jose Garza, is pressing charges against the clerk. He wants Yassine Naz, a man who's widely respected in his community, a man who actually contributes to our society, as you just heard. He's trying to send that man to prison for the rest of his life. So, but these two cases together, consider them in tandem. What's the message? Well, the message is if a violent felon starts terrorizing people in your store, ripping your store apart on which you rely for your livelihood, you can't do anything. If he goes back to his car to get a gun, you have to let it happen. So get shot or go to jail for the rest of your life. Those are your choices, which of course are not really choices at all. And these are not isolated cases that we cherry pick to make some polemical point. It's happening everywhere. Some people, the New York Times has explained, have views that are so reprehensible, these people are physically off limits. You cannot be in the same room with people like that. You can't talk to them. You can't ask them questions. Their opinions are like smallpox, communicable and deadly. These are the thought criminals, and thought crimes are the only crimes that matter. Other crimes, not such a big deal. Murder and rape and carjacking, nah. As the New York Times has often told us, people who do those things are the victims of your racism, so they deserve compassion. So news of this case, obviously, traveled past Arizona, and people were justly outraged by what is being done to this man. So people tried to raise money to pay that bail on GoFundMe. But GoFundMe wouldn't allow that. This elderly man rotting in jail while his wife lives alone on a border that the Democratic Party has kept open, you can't raise money for his bail. They shut down, GoFundMe shut down the effort to raise bail for this guy. Now, of course, you can raise money for BLM as they burn our country down to make sure Donald Trump is not reelected, but you're not allowed to raise money for people who are being held on $1 million bail on first-degree murder charges for defending their own property along an open border. True insanity, and a danger to all of us. And let's have a national referendum on what ought to happen to the man who shot the armed robber. You're eating with your family in a restaurant, some lunatic in a mask comes in and shoves a gun in your face, what you think is a gun, and steals your money. And somebody stands up and shoots him back. What percentage of Americans think that guy should go to jail? Right around 0, probably. But Houston police, along with the county district attorney, are putting that man in front of a grand jury to send him to prison. They're saying he shot the criminal one too many times. Okay. It's not hard to see why people are making sure they're putting down violent thugs. If they don't, they'll get out of jail and start terrorizing more people. Cultivating joy and love wherever you go. This in response to the murder of children by a self-described trans person. You're the victim, transgenderists, not the dead children in Nashville. And of course, virtually everyone in power in this country agreed. Amazon, the company, sent an email to its employees from its LGBTQ plus department, assuring its trans employees that they were affirmed and they were great people. No mention whatsoever of the dead children in Nashville. Their concern was the only concern. And then NBC News ran this headline, one of many like it. Tennessee's trans community's concerned because of the focus on the identity of the shooter. No update from NBC on how the Christian community in Nashville is doing, because who cares? They're just mortals. Their concerns aren't meaningful. So what's interesting is that this last few days has been like the few days before that. There's been a lot of moral outrage in Washington about bad ideas. And of course, some ideas are bad on both sides, for sure. But ideas aren't criminal. Actions are criminal. And as always, the real criminals are getting away with it. Just how filthy and dishonest our news media are. You'll be in the shower and you'll think they're bad, but how bad are they? In fact, this is pretty clearly the beginning of the end for Joe Biden. We can't prove that. The future is unknowable. But holy smokes, it does not look good. And it doesn't look good in a very recognizable way. The other channels took hundreds of millions of dollars from big pharma companies, and then they shilled for their sketchy products on the air. And as they did that, they maligned anyone who was skeptical of those products. At the very least, this was a moral crime. It was disgusting, but it was universal. It happened across the American news media. They all did it. Either way, if you're an honest person, you understand this is exactly the moment in our history when we need serious adult conversations about the world around us, a world that is changing to our detriment, and how we ought to respond to those changes. Bobby Kennedy would love to have those conversations. He's not running to get rich. He's running to make things better, but he's not allowed to have those conversations. He's been censored. Other media won't even talk to him. He criticized their advertisers. Well, as you've just heard, the Biden administration spends an awful lot of time covering up actual crimes committed by their political allies and their relatives. But for their critics, there is no such mercy. For the first time in our history, the government has begun to arrest people for saying things the White House doesn't like. That's the end of the First Amendment. Speech that's been protected for centuries in the United States is no longer protected. It's now a criminal act. Even if he was wrong, it would still be constitutionally protected speech. In a free country, which we had until recently, you are allowed by definition to have dumb opinions. Most of us do, but not anymore. So that man you just saw is facing 10 years behind bars for expressing views about Ukraine that the Biden administration doesn't want to hear. That's terrifying. Does no one else think that's terrifying? It is terrifying. Is any news organization you know of so corrupt that it's willing to hurt you on behalf of its biggest advertisers? Anyone who do that is obviously Pablo Escobar level corrupt and should not be trusted. What would that look like? That level of corruption. Imagine the administration declared that if you didn't rush out and buy at least one MyPillow and then at least another booster pillow, you would not be allowed to eat out. You couldn't re-enter your own country. You couldn't have a paying job. MyPillow, they told you with a straight face, was the very linchpin of our country's public health system. Now imagine as they told you that Fox, as a news organization, endorsed it, amplified the government's message. Imagine if Fox News attacked anyone who refused to buy MyPillow as an ally of Russia, as an enemy of science. And then imagine that Fox kept up those libelous attacks even as evidence mounted that MyPillow caused heart attacks, fertility problems, and death. If Fox News did that, what would you think of Fox News? Would you trust us? Of course you wouldn't. You would know that we were liars. The question is, who is telling the truth? There are not many of those. One of them is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Science has since proven Robert F. Kennedy Jr. right, unequivocally right. But Kennedy was not rewarded for this. He was vilified. He was censored because he dared to criticize their advertisers. The news media called Bobby Kennedy a Nazi, and then they attacked his family. This is one of those moments when it's nice to have a truth teller around. It's helpful because suddenly the stakes are very high. Considering what's happening in Ukraine, a topic most of us don't know much about because the details are not reported. It was a year ago that every media outlet in the United States, from USA Today to the New York Times, told you it was a dangerous conspiracy theory to believe the US government had ever funded secret biolabs in Ukraine. The idea was ridiculous. In fact, it was Russian disinformation. And then one day, in sworn testimony, Toria Nuland of the State Department accidentally admitted that it was true. Yes, she said, there are many secret biolabs in Ukraine. And, quote, we are now in fact quite concerned that Russian troops, Russian forces, may be seeking to gain control of them. Wait a second, you may be wondering. Why does the US government maintain secret biolabs in a primitive country like Ukraine? Why not Austria? Why Ukraine? And why didn't we dismantle and remove these secret biolabs when the war with Russia started? Nobody ever explained that. This show was attacked for asking the question. Now we have learned that actually it is far worse than just biolabs. Not only has the Biden administration been maintaining these labs in Ukraine in the middle of a war, it also has, quote, sensitive nuclear technology in Ukraine as well. And no, we're not making that up. They admitted it today. The latest group of Americans to find their constitutionally protected opinions become felonies are, believe it or not, an organization of black nationalist left-wingers who oppose the war in Ukraine. The DOJ has just charged many in this group with seeking to, quote, sow discord, spread pro-Russia propaganda, and interfere in elections within the United States. Now, there's no evidence they interfered with any election. You're allowed to be pro-Russia. You're allowed to be pro-anything you want in the United States. Saying things the government doesn't like, having unfashionable opinions or opinions that are out of step with Joe Biden's opinions, that is not a crime. You can spread pro-Russia propaganda if you want to. You can spread anti-Russia propaganda if you want to. You can say whatever you want, but not anymore. According to the indictment, the criminals in question, quote, wrote articles that contained Russian propaganda and disinformation. Huh? Now, you're very familiar with these points because you have heard them every day since last February. You've heard them repeated by every power center in the United States, the Pentagon, the White House, the leaders of both parties in Congress, CEOs, and celebrities. And most insistently of all, you've heard them from virtually every single outlet along the entire spectrum of our national news media. These are the two essential themes of the war in Ukraine, and both of them are lies. We know that they're lies because late last week, leaked intelligence about the war in Ukraine began to appear on social media. Briefing slides prepared by the US government began to show up, among other places, on Twitter. And the slides show that this is in fact not Ukraine's war. It's our war. The United States is a direct combatant in a war against Russia. As we speak, American soldiers are fighting Russian soldiers. So this is not a regional conflict in Eastern Europe. This is a hot war between the two primary nuclear superpowers on Earth. And yet this war has never been formally declared. It has not been authorized by Congress. And for that reason, this war is a violation of American law. It is a crime. The second thing we learn from these slides is that despite direct US involvement, Ukraine is in fact losing the war. 7 Ukrainians are being killed for every Russian. Ukrainian air defenses have been utterly degraded. Ukraine is losing. The Biden administration is perfectly aware of this. They're panicked about it, but they have lied about this fact to the public. Just 2 weeks ago, for example, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin told the US Senate that Russian military power is, quote, waning. In other words, Russia is losing the war. That was a lie. He knew it was when he said it, but he repeated it in congressional testimony. That is a crime. But Lloyd Austin has not been arrested for committing that crime. Instead, the only man who has been taken into custody, or likely ever will be, is a 21-year-old Massachusetts Air National Guardsman who leaked the slides that showed that Lloyd Austin was lying. He revealed the crimes, therefore he's the criminal. That's how Washington works. Telling the truth is the only real sin. What exactly is, quote, sensitive American nuclear technology? Sensitive American nuclear technology? Probably not to produce energy. No one in the media is going to ask that question. But if it's in the middle of Ukraine, in the middle of a war, it stands to reason this sensitive American nuclear technology has military applications. In other words, these are nuclear weapons. What else could they be? We'll stop speculating there. But take 3 steps back. This is all so crazy and so reckless, it is hard to believe it's happening. Here you have a Democratic president gone completely off the rails, completely, with existentially dangerous consequences, prosecuting a war that can only hurt the United States. A war with no upside. It is awful to watch. But it is not without precedent. Something similar happened 55 years ago in 1968, another remarkably turbulent and ugly year in American history that has many parallels to this. That spring, in March of 1968, Robert F. Kennedy Sr., the former Attorney General, the brother to the slain president, announced his candidacy against the incumbent, fellow Democrat Lyndon Johnson. And the overriding issue then, as now, was a pointless war then in progress. To be clear, Robert F. Kennedy was not against all war on principle. He was against that war because he believed, with a lot of evidence, that it was not helping the United States in any way. But you weren't allowed to say that. He did. Party bosses hated him for that, but rank and file Democrats loved him. They put pictures of his face in their homes like icons. In the end, they named a football stadium after him in Washington. That was more than half a century ago, but now Kennedy's son is embarking on a similar challenge to his own party and for similar reasons. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. announced today that he is running for president in the primary against Joe Biden. In fact, this is pretty clearly the beginning of the end for Joe Biden. We can't prove that. The future is unknowable. But holy smokes, it does not look good. And it doesn't look good in a very recognizable way. Somewhere in his basement rec room, drinking a Courvoisier on ice, Andrew Cuomo is chuckling to himself. He's seen this movie before. Joe Biden's own aides keep finding stacks of felonies he's left around the place, in his office, in his car. And instead of throwing this evidence in the fireplace, as under normal circumstances they would, they're sending these documents on to the Justice Department. That's not a good sign. Meanwhile, Biden's Attorney General, the most unscrupulous, unethical Attorney General this country has ever had, has somehow decided that actually, in order to maintain his unsullied record of nonpartisanship, he's going to have to pass these documents, these stacks of felonies, onto an independent counsel because that always works out well for a sitting president. And by the way, in this case, the independent counsel is a Republican. So the Department of Justice knew on November 4th that Joe Biden had committed crimes. November 4th was 4 days before a pivotal midterm election. So naturally, the DOJ didn't issue a press release about it. They didn't dispatch the FBI to raid Biden's home in Rehoboth and root through Dr. Jill's underwear drawer. No chance of that. Biden may be a terrible president, but he's still a Democrat. It's not like he's orange. So Merrick Garland, who is, and we cannot emphasize this enough, a soulless hack who will do anything the Democratic Party requires of him. Merrick Garland kept the news secret long enough to keep other Democrats out of the blast zone. Why hurt everybody else? They're just trying to hurt one guy. It's Joe Biden. So it wasn't until today that we knew Biden had been stashing state secrets in his Corvette. If you're still wondering where there is an organized effort within the White House to hurt Joe Biden, all you need to know is this: his staff keeps putting him out there in public to talk, which of course he can't do. He can barely read a prepared statement. Notice they did not do that during the last presidential campaign in 2020 because they knew it wouldn't help and they wanted the White House. And it helps even less now, but they're doing it. Why are they doing that now? Well, here's a guess. Right after the midterm elections in November, Joe Biden made it clear he had no plans to step aside and make way for Kamala Harris or Gavin Newsom or Michelle Obama. I'm thinking of running again, he said, and he seemed to mean it. Oh, he shouldn't have said that. Next thing you know, he's got a special counsel crawling around his life, armed with subpoena power and a big staff and a big budget. Well, that's how things work in Washington, they'll tell you. Oh, no, it's not. No, it's not. Not unless you have no choice. If you're the President of the United States, a special counsel is the last thing you want. Why? Because you have no idea where that investigation will go. Ask Bill Clinton. He's still mad about it. And that's why there was no special counsel appointed when Hunter Biden's laptop proved that the Biden family was selling influence to the Chinese government. That's why no special counsel ever interviewed Tony Bobulinski. Because that was all before Joe Biden suggested he might run again and thwart the ambitions of the next generation of Democratic candidates. So Joe Biden is in very serious trouble tonight. The classified documents that Joe Biden, quote, stored in his garage and left at the Penn Center have been floating around for a full 6 years since Joe Biden left the vice president's office in January of 2017. So it's fair to assume they've been moved around a lot, but they're suddenly surfacing now, right after the midterm election? Why is that? No one has even attempted a convincing explanation. Instead, the media is pretending to argue that it's not a big deal in the first place that Joe Biden stored classified documents near his Corvette because he admitted doing it when he got caught. And if you admit you've committed a crime, it's not a crime. Weirdly, we haven't heard a lot about the federal tax investigation into Hunter Biden since. And that is strange if you think about it, since we now have tens of thousands of new IRS agents to enforce tax law. And in fact, it wasn't that long ago that the Biden Justice Department, do you remember this? Indicted Donald Trump's 75-year-old accountant because he failed to declare the full value of his work vehicle. I think he was in handcuffs. But somehow these same enforcers of the law cannot be bothered to bring the Hunter Biden investigation to fruition. Not when they have a laptop proving that he took millions from the government of China. How does that work exactly? Did he pay every dollar in federal taxes? Did he fully declare the value of his work vehicle or of his crack?